So now we're going to look at accidental dignities, or basically everything other than the major dignities or the essential dignities. So if we look back to the other dignity chart, you'll notice that everything that we gave a score for were things like where the planet was, where the planet was, where it was, etc. You get the idea. So everything was based upon where the planet was located to make this score. But this is not the final grade that we're going to give the planet. We need to do other considerations. And you have an endless supply of these things. We're going to go over the major ones that most people agree are the major ones. So these are going to be the moon, the void, of course, and the via combusta, or burned up road. So where the moon moves around is going to be important, right? Because that is your co-significator for most people's documentation is books. You have the moon as a co-significator. Now some will say the moon only applies if you're female. If you're male, then you have a sun co-significator. We'll talk about that later. The next thing is, are you a good or bad house? So across the zodiac, some houses are good, like the first house of self is good. The 10th house of career is good, but the 12th house of hidden information is bad, for example. We'll talk about that. And then, is the planet retrograde? And how fast is that planet moving? So between retrograde and direct, we have what's called a station, which is basically a very confusing point and a bad point to where it's about to go retrograde or it's about to go direct. And then we'll talk about sex, which is if it's in day or night based upon the planet, and joys, where the planet loves to be. And lastly, we're going to talk about the sun. So you could be under the beams, you could be a bunch of different things that the sun can do. So let's talk about all of those things. So let's quickly go to our favorite Wikipedia and talk about, so an accidental dignity occurs when a planet gains strength for any other reason other than where it's located. So where it's located is important for the essential, but the accidental, we have other stuff. So you can hit Wikipedia and get a little information, not much, but a little information. So let's hop in first off and say good and bad house. So we have good and bad houses, and different books actually say that some houses are good and some are bad. For example, I've seen some documentation that says, for example, that the second house is bad. But if you look at our good friend Astrofox with the accidental dignities, it talks about in the house right here. So the object is the planet, so the sun, the moon, etc. And the first thing we're going to talk about here is in the house. So is it a good house or a bad house? Now the bad houses are considered 6, 8, and 12. So we'll assume that 2 is good. Again, different books say different things about 2. Maybe the wealth corrupts you, I'm not sure. So the 6th house is the house of sort of labor or manual work that you don't enjoy doing. This is your day-to-day work. It's a negative house in almost every respect. It's also your co-workers and things like that. But the 6th house is just a bad house. The 8th house is death, taxes, and other people's money. Again, because it relates to death, that's sort of a negative house, and the 8th house is considered bad. And finally, the 12th house, the house of karma, hidden information, hidden things, is basically a bad house as well. So you can see the 6 and the 12 across from each other, and then the 8. So when you look at the in-house right here from Astrofox, you'll see it's in-house 9 is good, 10 is good, 7 is good, etc. And then when we get to 8 or 12, it's bad. Now, this particular site considers 2 is good, but again, some books say 2 is bad. And 2 is the personal possessions that you can move around, and your wealth, your accounts, your money. and some to say it's bad, but this says it's good. You know, make your own determination if it's bad or good, but that's pretty much the first accidental dignity we'll talk about, is the good and the bad houses, easily represented here. Let's talk about void of course moon, or when the moon is in the void. A great site, if you want to look for more information about this, is Rachel Stewart Haas. Has an excellent site of the void of course moon and has plenty of dates and times. So it's also in Eastern, which I find nice. So if you want to look at a void of course moon, you can just look up when it starts and when it ends and where it will be. So what is a void of course moon? That is when the moon, let's say the moon is in the 9th house down here. The moon has entered the 9th house and is moving along through, as you can see, Libra. So it's moving through this sign. So as it moves during the last major aspect, and there are multiple definitions of this, I'm going for the most popular one, the one in most books and sites. The last major aspect the moon makes between that and when it leaves the sign, in other words, it's going to move out of Libra right here. So this area right here, where it makes no more major aspects, is considered into the void. And if you look at this graphical representation here, so we have this void of course section right here. And depending upon the sign, depending upon the aspects, etc., it could be a few minutes or it could be a few days. And again, we can go back to the site and get a calculation as to when it starts and when it stops. So for example, on July 5th, it starts at 2:26 a.m. Eastern, and then it ends on the 6th at 12:25 a.m. So again, it could be a few minutes, a few hours, it could be a couple of days. It all depends, again, on what's aspecting the moon and what's not. But this is called a void of course. So what does this mean for us when someone asks a question? Now, there's a lot of definitions for this. Some definitions say that don't make any major decisions during this time period. Some definitions say if somebody asks a question during this time period, the immediate answer is no. So again, it kind of depends on what you're looking at or who you're referencing. But it basically means it's a terrible time to ask the question. It's a terrible time to ask a question. So you can see here that the sun is at 15 degrees and the moon is at 15 degrees. That's the last major aspect, and that's a sextile you can see down here. So that's the last major aspect we have for this. You could have a situation to where, let's erase this, could have a situation to where maybe the sun, for example, is going to be conjunct. So we have a sun here, and this could be the last major aspect that he makes. And then he goes into the void. Or you could have a situation where the void doesn't exist, or the void's really small. So maybe the sun is here, and the last major aspect he has is passing through the sun here, and this time period right here is relatively short. It's shorter than this time period from here to here, right? So anyway, that's sort of what you get with the void of course moon. It's when the moon moves between the last major aspect to when it exits that particular sign. So now let's talk about Via Combusta. Before I show you what it is, a great article on Kepler College. Kepler College has a nice article. This is also called the Burned Way, or the Burned Road, Burned Up Road, etc. That's basically only applies to the moon, and that's when the moon enters 15 degrees of Libra all the way over to 15 degrees of Scorpio. So during this time, it is considered to be Via Combusta, on the burned up road, the burned way, the malefic way, whatever they call it. And it basically means that we're under emotional distress. So if you're asking about your husband or something like this is going to be a negative thing when the moon is in here, and as the moon moves across, luckily the moon is quick, so it's not in here like a long time, but this is considered a prominent thing in a lot of the horary books, where we have this area here where it's moving, and if it's within this area, then that means emotional distress or something like that. So some books say it's not a good time for making decisions, making major decisions and things like this, but other times it signals emotional distress of the person asking the question. Since the moon is the co-significator of, let's say, most women, etc., then some books say most co-significator of anyone. Some books say co-significator should be sun for men and moon for women, and some say it's moon for everybody. But anyway, the moon is important, and when it's moving through here, that's going to be a time to where it's going to be bad to ask a question. It's going to weigh sort of negatively on the question as well. So ignore the houses. These are just numbers are here for example. This can be in any house. It's just when the moon is in this area. So that is via combusta, or the burned road. So the next thing let's talk about is speed. So the speed of the planet. Direct and fast means it's moving normally. Very fast, it means it's moving quickly. And this is important for your question. So if it's moving slowly, again, that's going to be important. Now, retrograde and things like this. So we need to talk about the next part, which is going to be called station. So let's say our favorite planet Saturn is moving along. So direct means it's moving along normally. Direct is a normal movement from here to here. So as it's moving, it's direct. Now, a planet can be moving fast, slow, etc. And again, that's important. We'll talk about that in a minute. But for now, let's talk about what's called station and retrograde. So as the planet is moving, it will sometimes retrograde, meaning it'll move a little backwards. So while it is in retrograde, it is in motion, but obviously the wrong way. And then it will stop moving backwards, and it will start moving forward again. So what is station? Station is when it's completely stopped. So there's two stations, right? Obviously, just looking at the situation, we have two stations. One is going to be here, where you actually go retrograde. So it's actually starting to go backwards. So between that point to where it's moving, and now it's starting to move backwards, we have a stopped position, and that is called station. Now this is an extreme weakness and vulnerability for the situation, for this particular planet. So Saturn is a very bad place once it's completely stopped at a station. Now again, there's two stations. There's one is going to be when it starts to retrograde, and another is going to be when it starts to go direct again. So we have two of these. So let's do both. So Saturn is going direct, 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 and right here it's stopped, so it's at station. So station is going to be bad, a bad vulnerability for the planet. Now it's going retrograde, and now it's moving. Retrograde is not good by itself, but retrograde does have meaning. It means that something is returning. So if you have a question, is my husband coming back, or is my cat coming back? Retrograde, it indicates a return of something, so that's a good situation. So it's not always bad, especially in the context of people asking questions for horary analysis. So as it goes retrograde. Now, it's going to stop going retrograde and then start moving in a normal place again. And then it's stopped. So again, we have two stopped situations. One when it's going retrograde, and one when it's done going retrograde and it starts moving back to the positions. So both are called station, and both are negative situation for the planet, and it's a weak spot for the planet. So if your ruler of the question or something like this is in a stopped or station situation, we could have a lot of different meanings for that. And we'll go over tons and tons of these when we get to the examples. I'll probably have like 50 examples, so you're going to get way more than you probably want, but it'll definitely sort of round this out and give you a sort of a big overview of how the whole thing works. So that is station, and that is also fast, very fast, direct, slow, retrograde, etc. So that's the second column in our wonderful Astrofox site. So the last thing we'll cover before we go into a summary is combustion and under the beams. So these are all to do, as you can tell, with the sun. So anything that deals with the sun will start following under these rules. So the first thing we want to learn is combustion. This is insanely important. Apparently from all the books, this one thing could be a no to whatever question that you have. It's very bad. And that is when a planet is within 8.5 degrees of the sun, it is considered combust. So here we have the moon within that 8.5 degree range, and that is going to be combustion. So now, important to note, it must be in the same sign. So if we have the sun sort of lingering on the edge of a sign, and then right beside it is the moon, but it's in a different sign, then that is not combust. Combust is only in the same sign. So if it is within 8.5 degrees of the sun, then it is combust. All right, so it must be in the same sign, 8.5 degrees, you get the idea. Outside of that, into a 17.5 degree, you're now under the beams. So this has to do with the distance of the planet from the sun. So the moon is obviously going this way, right? So we're moving this way. So right here, it's under the beams. So under the beams, it's going to be sort of trivial at this point because we're sort of edged at the edge of under the beams. And then as we move up to combustion, it's going to get more critical and more critical. And then we hit combustion, and that is going to be devastating. That's going to be bad. So here we get combustion, and we start moving into this bad space. Now again, as we sort of go away from combustion, it gets a little better. We're still under the beams, but it gets a little better, a little better. Now, important to note, if we go into the next sign, so in other words, under the beam, that's a large area. If we go into the next sign away from here and we're still under the beams, it's trivial. It's less important because we moved signs. Let me sort of graphically represent this. Can I get this done here? So let's go to a brush and pick up white, and let's say we go from here to here. All right, so now we're in the next sign. So we're into the next sign, but we're still under the beams. Because we moved out of that other sign, it's trivial and it's less important, even though we're still under the beams technically right here. But we're in a new sign, so again, trivial. So again, as we go, it gets worse. It's not too bad because we're in that range. It gets worse and worse and worse. Now it's bad. Now we're in combustion. And now everything is terrible and everything is bad. And again, we'll go through this with examples. So we'll look at where it is in combustion versus where it is in under the beams. Because obviously still under the beams is here, but it's not that bad compared to under the beams like right here. And you can see that in the Astrofox chart where we have sunbeams. And so he says under the beams, but there's no, or it's free of sunbeams. So that's highlighted red. But again, that's sort of, you need to really have context of where this thing is at. So you need to look at the chart. Again, 8.5 degrees is going to be critically bad. Under the beams is going to be less. But he says under the beams, but under the beams here, it's going to be more critical than under the beams here. So you kind of got to look. You can't really just take this as sunbeams. Let me count it as red because we're under the beams. So again, that's one of those things where we have combust versus under the beams, etc. So again, you really need context to sort of understand that, and to take that into consideration, you're going to need to look at the chart and not be too concerned with under the beams or not under the beams. If you're in combustion, then yes, no matter where you are in combustion, it's bad, unless you're in the exact center point, which is Cazimi, which we're not going to do, but So other than that, then, oh, that was bad. Other than that, well, anywhere in combustion is going to be bad. Anywhere in combustion is going to be bad. Under the sunbeams, not so much. So again, in context, really need to sort of take that in. But that is the last piece of the puzzle for accidental dignities, which is sun and under the beams and combustion. So let's go over lesser considerations, and then we'll sort of sum it up, look at some examples, and then round this out. And as always, I'd like to thank my Patreon supporters who donate money to me to keep my quest going. My quest is simple. I want to teach you tarot, Lenormand, I want to teach you Kipper, I want to teach you everything that I possibly can. Astrology, obviously, as well. And they help me by supporting me and helping pay for the software that I use and all the fancy effects you see and the microphone that I'm using, etc., etc. So my current Patreon supporters, thank you so much. They are Allie Cat, Annie Lemaster, Carolyn Borchard, Crystal McGinn, Gary Fink, Hot Chocolate, Janet Littler, Jessica Mante, KSW, La Ami, Peter, Richard Zeh, Scott Miller, Shintaro Kuga, SJP, and Tina Iovero. Thank you so much. You can find a Patreon link in the description if you're interested in helping me out as well. If not, that's fine too. I would just ask, please hit like and subscribe. It gets more traffic to the channel. It gets more exposure to all the fun things that I do on the channel. Thank you so much for watching.